Welcome to our new talk series for the Tombs of the Isles project. I'm Dan Lee, the project leader, and I'm going to introduce the project through this introductory talk. You can find out more on our website. Visit archaeologyorkney.com/Tombs of the Isles. Please be aware that this talk contains human remains in skeletal form. We're really excited to bring you this new talk series. So there are 5 talks. The talk 1, I'm going to introduce you to the project and take you on a bit of a tour around the North Isles of Orkney. In talk 2, we've got Professor Colin Richards, who's talking about death and burial in Neolithic Orkney. And that talk comes in 2 parts. Talk 3, we have Dr. Antonia Thomas talking about art and architecture in Neolithic Orkney. Talk 4, Antonia again talks about passage grave art in the North Isles. And finally, talk 5, Antonia talks about rock art in the home of Papa Westry South Tomb as a case study to finish with. So I'm going to introduce you to the project. We're going to talk briefly about Neolithic tombs and Neolithic Orkney, although this is going to be covered in more detail in talk 2. And then we're going to take a little bit of a tour around the North Isles, looking at different case studies from the islands that we've covered to show you some of the details of some of these exciting Neolithic tombs we've been exploring. So the Tombs of the Isles project has run for a couple of years, from 2021 to 2023. It's basically been around celebrating, researching and sharing the stories of the Neolithic tombs in the North Isles of Orkney. We've had an activities programme. We've not done any excavation, but we've undertaken non-intrusive survey, such as geophysical survey at a number of sites. We've undertaken a number of site visits. We've had drop-ins with the local island residents, talks, walks, art and archaeology workshops and school workshops. We've also produced a number of 3D models, and I'll highlight those as we go through. The things we've produced have been a website, so do explore our website, the address is below. We've produced reports, this talk series, and we're producing a poster leaflet which will help visitors and residents explore the Neolithic tombs of the North Isles of Orkney. And eventually these details and the results from our work will go to update the National Monument Record. So what sort of questions have we been exploring during the project? Well, we've been asking some simple questions. Where are our tombs? Why are they located where they are? How do they sit within the landscape? Can we access them? Are they on private land or are they open to the public to visit? What are they like and how are they built? What was inside them? What was found if they were excavated? Where is that material? Where's it ended up now? And what were they used for? Are there any stories about the tombs that we can find? And how can we investigate the tombs during the project? And ultimately, how can we celebrate them? This amazing selection of monuments that we have surviving across the North Isles. So we're hoping we'll explore these themes throughout these talks, and you'll find more information on our website. Before we start on our tour, let's just think a little bit about Neolithic Orkney. Of course, maybe we're more familiar with the really famous Neolithic sites such as the Ring of Brodgar, massive stone circle in the middle of the west mainland of Orkney, the Neolithic settlement at Skara Brae, the standing stones of Stennis, and together these of course make up part of the Heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site. And perhaps you know something about Maes Howe, the most iconic Neolithic tomb that we have in Orkney, part of the Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site. This massive mound contains a huge chamber with massive stones forming uprights in the corner, exquisite stonework, Neolithic carvings, and even Viking runes. It has a solar alignment where the midwinter sunset shines up the passage and illuminates the wall. But even with this most iconic monument, we actually know very little about what was going on inside in the Neolithic, as this was excavated in the mid-19th century, and the small amount of human remains that were found have been lost, unfortunately. So even though we know maybe a lot about the structure, we know very little about the burial rites and the burials that occurred within the tomb. And you'll find this is maybe a common theme. We think we maybe know a lot about some of the Neolithic tombs in Orkney, but actually when they were dug in the 19th century, there are very few records, and often the finds are lost. So these are the sorts of questions we're hoping to answer when we explore some of the lesser known tombs in Orkney, exploring sites that we trying to find clues that we might have about where the human remains are, what's known from some of these earlier investigations. Some of the famous tombs in Orkney include the Coines tomb in Sandy, this impressive central chamber with the walls coming in as they rise up to the original roof. We have Maes Howe, of course, which we've just been thinking about, but also Midhow in Rousey, which even has a building built across the top with its impressive long chamber with uprights forming stalls along the length. There's the Dwarfy Stone in Hoy, Britain's only rock-cut Neolithic tomb with its cells and chamber inside. And of course, the Tomb of the Eagles down in South Ronaldsay, which is one of the most popular visitor attractions in Orkney, which unfortunately you can't visit just at the moment, which was excavated with a series of skulls found inside the cells. So where are our tombs in Orkney? Well, there are a staggering 81 tombs that we know of. There's undoubtedly more to be discovered, and you can find them across most islands spread out from Hoy to some of the small islands in Scapa Flow, the mainland of Orkney, and of course in the North Isles. And this project is focusing on the North Isles of Orkney, so we're not going to be covering the tombs on the mainland or further south. And all these tombs are documented and recorded in an amazing study by Davidson and Henshaw, published in 1989 in this book, The Chambered Cairns of Orkney. Unfortunately, this book's out of print, but you might be able to find a second-hand copy if you search. And this map shows the distribution of Neolithic chambered tombs, and I've also added Neolithic settlements and standing stones, just for a bit of context, across the North Isles of Orkney. And you can see the distribution, and actually more of the tombs are located in the North Isles. So 53 out of the known 81 are located in the North Isles. And you can see every island in the North Isles every major island has some, if not more, Neolithic tombs. The only one without any known Neolithic tombs is North Ronaldsay. So we'll be going around a little tour, island by island, in this talk, just to give you a sense of the different tombs. And then some of these details and some of these themes will be covered in more detail in the other talks. The Neolithic was a time of great change in Orkney. We find new forms of architecture, such as houses and tombs. People were settling down and moving away from the hunter-gatherer lifestyle that communities had occupied the islands had practiced before. We find new forms of material culture, such as pottery, flint axes, different types of flint working. It's when we first find domesticated animals, and people were growing crops and settling down in certain places in the landscape. This was a world of stone. Although some of the earliest houses are in fact made of timber, tombs appear to have always been built from stone, whether upright stones forming the primary phase of the monument, creating stalls in a central chamber where the remains of the dead were buried. We also see this as the first kind of evidence for communal burial, where bones were all mixed up together. So individuals didn't retain their identity in death so much, and the bones were mixed up and placed in the central chamber, and became kind of part of the ancestral world. So it's through the negotiations of these different things, through sites like Neolithic tombs, that perhaps new forms of political order and political structure emerged. So some of the common features within Neolithic tombs in Orkney, we can see the chamber there with the large upright stones, with the walls built around. So these different stalls inside, this is where bones and bodies were laid to rest. We think that skeletons may have been placed in the chambers or within the entrance passages, and then the bones were then moved around and mixed together within the tombs, perhaps coming out for certain rituals and ceremonies out of the outside world. The entrance passages are often very low and confined, creating this very distinctive internal space within the mound. It's quite an experience trying to crawl into some of these tombs, and there's a definite separating of the inside and the outside world. Some of the other tombs have side cells instead of stalls, and sometimes there's a mixture of both. So you can see the central chamber here on the right with a series of side cells where bones were deposited running off from the side. And it's not just human remains that we find within Neolithic tombs in Orkney when they've been excavated. And the artifacts vary quite widely across the different islands and different tombs. But some of the finds include round-based pots, unstoneware pots with these highly decorated collars, grooved-ware pots, stone tools such as hammerstones and polished stone axes, flint tools, flint knives, and even flint flakes, and even some more highly prized objects such as mace heads that we can see in the bottom right. Perhaps these were offerings for the individuals buried in the tomb. Perhaps they were offerings to the ancestors or for use in the afterlife. Neolithic tombs have certainly captured the imagination of antiquarians and archaeologists over the centuries. Often, a lot of the early excavations were investigating Neolithic tombs. We find lots of unrecorded excavations on various sites across the islands. And it's only recently that we've got better at finding Neolithic settlement and identifying those. So often the archaeological sites that have been investigated in Orkney early on are the Neolithic tombs. So from amateurs and early antiquarians such as James Farrer at Maze Howe in the mid-19th century, and Gordon Child, of course, who excavated Skara Brae, but also excavated Neolithic tombs such as Coyness and Sandy in the mid-20th century. Later on, we have a more scientific approach from archaeologists such as Colin Renfrew, who is interested in trying to accurately date the sequences from the Neolithic and date the monuments. So he investigated the Ring of Brodgar, but he also did some excavations at Neolithic tombs such as Quantonettes. And more recently, archaeologists like John Hedges and his investigations with Ronnie Simonson at the Tomb of the Eagles. So there's a lot of characters, a lot of interest in the archaeology in Neolithic tombs in Orkney over the years. So we're going to start our island tour in Westray and Papa Westray, and these have their fair share of tombs, Westray with 10 and Pappy with 3, but also we have 2 Neolithic settlements. So the early Neolithic settlement of Napa Hawa on Papa Westray and the Links of Noltland, the ongoing excavations there, this extensive Neolithic settlement in the northern part of Westray. We have some excavations as well, so the excavations in the 1980s at Peerwell Quarry will cover some of these case studies, and at Point of Cop, where a horned Neolithic tomb was excavated in the 1990s. And then, of course, the famous home of Papa Westray tomb that we'll look at as well. But although we know quite a lot about several of the tombs in Westray, as is often the case in the North Isles and across Orkney, there are lots of other tombs that we know very little about. So, for example, these are planned views of the different tombs. So Powdykes, you can see the mound there, and the black shapes are the upright stones that are sticking up from the top of the mound. And as far as we know, some of these tombs have never been excavated. So we can get hints at the internal structures, perhaps the stalls or the cells and the walls, but we know very little about the internal architecture and if anything was found there. Some early excavations, if they've been recorded at all, have a mention in newspaper articles or various early accounts. However, often, as such the case with Veer Point, where an excavation occurred, the skeletons that were found unfortunately have now been lost. Similarly, at Kirkwoy, the only relics were of a quartz ball mixed with greenstone, but unfortunately the skeletal remains have been lost. So this is often the case, is that we know we've got little threads of information, but where human remains were recovered from some of the early excavations, and often the artifacts as well, we now don't know where these are. Perhaps the most famous Neolithic tomb in Westray is that of Peerwell Quarry, where stone quarrying in the 1980s discovered the remains of a Neolithic tomb. Part of it was damaged, but some of the remains survived, revealing it was a multi-phase site and the remains of 6 people were buried there. But perhaps the most remarkable find for the site are this spectacular decorated stone with these deeply incised concentric circles and spiral motifs. And we'll learn more about these from our talk with Dr. Antonia Thomas. And the stone itself can be viewed, is housed in the Westray Heritage Centre, and the stones at the top in Orkney Museum. And as part of this project, we've undertaken 3D models of these stones, and you can view those on our website. One of the more unusual Neolithic tombs to be excavated in Westbury and indeed in Orkney is the horned cairn at the Point of Cot. This site was being eroded by the sea. You can see it's located on a small beach cliff. So the whole eastern side of the monument was being damaged by the sea. And rescue excavations were undertaken by John Barber in the 1990s. And the horned cairn has these extensions of the outside of the tomb, which form a kind of forecourt area. You can see one of them on the bottom left there, the other one having been removed. And this unusual tomb had a whole series of internal revetment walls and also contained a chamber, a central chamber, and this had the remains of 5 adults and juveniles and infants. The important thing about modern excavations of tombs was the insights that can provide into the construction, the use and the closing of the tomb, because often when tombs have been excavated by antiquarians, they're digging through some of these later final moments and final phases of the use of the tomb, and it's closing off and not really paying that so much attention to it. So it's useful to undertake sort of modern excavations of tombs, such as the Point of Cot, to give us insights into some of these points in the tomb's life. Over on Papa Westbury, we have 3 Neolithic tombs, but all 3 of these are actually located on the small holm or island to the east of Papa Westbury, with the settlement site at Nap of Hower located on the main island itself. We have excavations that have been undertaken on the holm of Papa tombs, but the most famous one, of course, is the holm of Papa Westbury North, which you can visit today and climb down inside the chamber down an iron ladder and view the large, long chamber with all its side cells extending off. And of course, this is home to some of the Neolithic rock art that Antonio will be talking about in one of the later talks. So peck designs that we can find on the walls. The island of Ede certainly has its fair share of tombs, and located in quite prominent places in the landscape. Many of these were excavated in the late 19th century or early 20th century, often with the spoil from the excavations left around, leaving some of the internal features visible. The most famous tomb, of course, is Vincoy, and we'll have a look at that in a moment, situated on top of a very prominent hill in the northern part of the island, and you can actually visit this tomb and crawl inside. Some of the tombs are located on the Calf of Ede, a small island off to the north, with a group of Neolithic tombs on that small island, and even one on Ferry, the island just to the west of Ede. But unfortunately, we didn't manage to visit that tomb during the project. And we've created a new 3D model of some of these tombs during our work in the project, and you can explore those on our website online. Vincoy is certainly a highlight of the tombs of the North Isles. This large mound has an entrance passage leading to a large central chamber with 4 side cells leading off the side. It's got quite a different feel to it when you go inside. It's made from large blocks of red sandstone, similar to the material used to build the St Magnus Cathedral. But unfortunately, it was excavated by antiquarians in 1857, James Farrow and Robert Hebden, and we know very little about these early excavations. There were no recorded finds, and the excavations were only recorded very briefly by George Petrie later on. So it's one of these ones where it's an iconic site that we can go and visit, but we know very little about what was in there, which is a shame. The site was then backfilled, and it was sort of left vaguely safe and open for a number of years. But it wasn't until 1985 that a project with Jackie Marwick, with the Orkney Islands Council, where the tomb was re-excavated and cleaned out and made safe so that people could visit it. And we've made a new 3D model of this, which you can visit online if you go to our website, and so you can experience what it's like to go inside Vincoy tomb. The 3 tombs on the Calf of Ede have a similar story. These were excavated by James Farrow in the 1850s and then re-excavated this time by Calder in the 1930s. So here we have a group of Neolithic tombs that have some Iron Age structures around them and even Iron Age interventions into some of the tombs themselves. So quite a complex sequence of monuments. Some of the Iron Age structures are thought to be houses, and some of the tombs were indeed interpreted as Iron Age houses early on. But the Carp of Ely Long is unusual, the one you can see here with its sort of double tomb structure within the mound, so a stalled cairn and then a tripartite cairn built into the top. And Calder thought that these were both contemporary. And this contained quite a number of artifacts, including round-based pots, polished stone axes, and leaf-shaped arrowheads. Some of the other tombs in Ely include Braeside, which you can see here, this large mound containing a stalled chamber. And you can see here how it's been kind of excavated and the spoil has just been left by the side. So you can, even though you can visit this tomb and get a sense for the space inside, it's been altered quite a lot and not really reinstated after it had been excavated. Another tomb at Edy Manse, very little of the tomb survives. A lot of it was robbed out to build the neighbouring church and other structures. But during the excavations, this spectacular spiral decorated stone was found. And Antonio will be talking more about these later on. Next in our tour is Sandy, with its 5 Neolithic tombs. Now, some of these we know quite a lot about, such as the tomb at Coines, which we'll look at in a moment, and recent excavations at Tresnes. But the large mound on Start Point on the far eastern side of the island, the large mound of Mount Masery, this tomb's never been investigated. There were stories of chambers found and people going inside the entrance passage back in the 1960s, but this has been blocked off, and as far as we know, no excavations have been undertaken at the site. And there's the 2 recently discovered possible Neolithic tombs at Whale Point and Reethy Tomb, which we're going to be investigating as part of this project. It also has 2 Neolithic settlements, so that excavated as part of a multi-period settlement mound at Poole, where there's a Neolithic horizon found below a multi-period settlement site, and the Neolithic settlement at Stove in the southern part of the island, which has never been investigated, but again is a coastally eroding settlement site. And one of the most spectacular, and perhaps one of my favourite tombs in the North Isles, is at Coines in Sandy. This tomb again was excavated in the 1860s by James Farrer, where the bones of 14 or 15 individuals were found in the side cells, and bones were also found filling a rock-cut pit through the clay floor in the base of the central chamber. So the central chamber is really well preserved, and you can see a picture of it on the bottom right there with some of the side cells leading off. And Gordon Child re-excavated Coines in the early 1950s, and then it was presented and exposed and made accessible to the public, and you can still visit the site today. Child found that the tomb mound itself was made up of several phases, with a large kind of platform and a revetment wall encasing the original tomb around the outside. So the tomb itself had seen some modification. And here you can see a cross-section of the tomb from Child's report. So you can see the central chamber in the middle, and you can see the corbelling. This is where the walls kind of step in with every stone course to kind of narrow the span of the roof, and it gives this kind of quite towering effect when you're inside the chamber. And you can see the side cells there as well, heading up to a point within the main mound. And you can see the sort of the walls built around, encasing the central mound there, built as a later phase, and then the platform around the outside. Some of the more unusual objects from the Orcadian Neolithic were found within Coines tomb. These 2 sculpted objects you can see there, with these deeply carved grooves forming spikes, created these quite enigmatic objects. We're not quite sure what they were used for, but perhaps they form part of the ceremonies or burial rites of the individuals that were buried in the tomb. And Coines is also host to a number of Neolithic rock art carvings. You can see in the bottom right these very faintly incised markings that have been identified in the 1990s on the inside of the chamber wall. Some of them not perhaps forming the most coherent patterns, but some forming the kind of cross-hatching or sort of lozenge-shaped motifs that are more common in other Neolithic structures in Orkney. The tomb at Tresness has been recently excavated. This coastal eroding site was suffering quite serious erosion from the sea, and rescue excavations revealed a well-preserved stalled cairn. The expected inhumation burials inside didn't survive, which was a surprise. However, an interesting range of artifacts was recovered, including 2 polished stone balls and over 100 scale knives. These coarse knives that were found by Gordon Child and named after the site at Scour Brae. Carrying on our tour in Stronsay, the island has quite a number of tombs, mostly located around the coast, one of which is on Papa Stronsay and another on the Holm of Huip Islands just to the north of the island. But Stronsay hasn't had the same history of archaeological or antiquarian investigation. So even though we have a number of interesting sites, we actually know very little about them. And some of the early investigations where they did occur, we don't really have many details of what occurred. And we have undertaken some 3D models of some of the sites in Stronsay, which you can explore on our website. One such site is that at Cutter's Tooth, where, although we have no record of it actually being excavated, there are stories of the mound being much reduced in height, and it survives today as a low grassy mound within a field in a very prominent landscape location with commanding 360 views all around. Another site is the Long Mound on the island, the small Holm of Papa Stronsay, just to the north of the main island of Stronsay. And this large long mound, there are records mentioned in the statistical accounts of human remains having been found at the site, but unfortunately these fragments of human bone have now been lost. Other tombs in Stronsay include that at Lamb Ness in Kelsborough, where on top of the grassy mound you can make out the remains of the chamber, some of the chamber walling perhaps protruding from the grass, and upright stones showing that the internal space was divided into stalls. Kelsborough is located on the shore, although the site doesn't appear to be actively eroding, although it is in an exposed location. One site has been completely destroyed, that's at Water Kirbister, but there are records of a clay vessel being found there, although unfortunately that has since been lost. Shappensea has 3 Neolithic tombs and a large standing stone, that at the Moorstein, located on one of the higher parts of the island. One of the tombs, Helier Holm, is located on a small island just to the south. Castle Bloody is perhaps one of the most enigmatic tombs in Shappensea, if not for its name, but for the history of its kind of interpretation. So it's recorded as a chamber cairn in 1928, and then it's been suggested to be an Iron Age souterrain, a series of an underground chamber in 1981, and then again interpreted as a maze howe type Neolithic tomb, perhaps with side cells off the main chamber in the 1980s. And it's certainly a site that could do with some further investigation to try and understand the sequence of structures here. The site itself is visible as a quite prominent mound on the higher points of the island, and there's certainly been excavations down inside exposing a number of horizontal slabs which could form roof slabs or internal structures. But the mound itself remains quite enigmatic. Two of the more definitive Neolithic tombs in Shappensea include that at Hackness, which you can see from the plan there have sort of internal chamber has been exposed, showing a number of uprights forming stalls, but the site itself has seen quite a lot of later activity with enclosures and later post-medieval and modern enclosure walls built over the top of the monument. Human remains have been recorded in the vicinity, although those have since been lost. And whether they're from the site itself, we don't know. Another tomb on Helioholm. Again, you can see from the plan here, the internal chamber is evident on the ground surface with a number of uprights, and the tomb has later been used to host a marine marker cairn, a stone cairn, which helps with marine navigation. Rousey, Egglesey and Wyre certainly have their fair share of Neolithic tombs, standing stones and settlements. Rousey, sometimes known as the Egypt to the north, is famous for its archaeology of all periods, but it's particularly its Neolithic tombs, because in the early 20th century, a lot of the tombs were excavated by the Laird, Walter Grant, and working with Graham Callender from the National Museum. And these tombs were excavated and often recorded very well, and then they were presented to the public. So many of them had concrete caps put on top, so you can still visit the tombs today. So the tombs of Taverso Tuig, Blackhammer, Yarso, and of course Midhow are some of the ones that you can visit today. Rouse is also host to a famous Neolithic settlement excavated by Gordon Child in the 1940s, which the pottery there and the finds from there, along with Scarab Ray, helped form the big ideas at the time about the Neolithic in Britain. There's one Neolithic tomb on the island of Egglesey at Onibost, located on a steep promontory on the southern part of the island. And although Wyre doesn't have a known Neolithic tomb, although there's a suspected mound on the southern shore, it is home to a Neolithic settlement excavated in the 2000s in the centre of the island. Rousey's home to some of the most impressive Neolithic tombs in Orkney. None better than Midhow, seen here on the left and right, with its really long central chamber divided into multiple stalls with very large upright stones contained within this colossal stone-built mound. And this was excavated in the 1930s, and then it had a building built over the top of it to protect it and then allow the public to visit. And even up in the roof, there's a walkway where you can walk around and look down into the central chamber. Other tombs such as Ramsey as well and Rawigar have this arrangement with a long central chamber, lots of uprights forming stalls, and these were all again excavated in the 1930s. And there's even a film of one of the early excavations. It must be one of the earliest films of an archaeological excavation that we have, and that's at Rawigar on the west side of Rousey. And William Kirkness made a film of Walter Grant and Graham Callender's excavations in around 1937. And the amazing film kind of takes you on views. It's a silent film, but it takes you on these views around the site and then refers you to these maps that have been filmed with arrows showing you which parts of the tomb you're viewing. You can watch the full film on the Moving Image Archive on the National Library of Scotland website. One of the most unusual tombs in Rousey is that at Taverso Tuig, and this Macehow type tomb actually is a double-decker. So it has an upper tomb and a lower tomb with the entrances heading off in different directions. So you can see from the plan and cross section here the upper tomb with its cells, and then now you can access the lower tomb because one of the stones has been removed, and you can climb down a ladder inside the tomb. And even outside, there's a miniature tomb which seems to be contemporary with the main Neolithic monument. You can see that down in the bottom right there, a very small chamber where I think some pots were found when it was excavated, again in the 1930s. Taverso Tuig certainly occupies a prominent place in the landscape. Situated up on a slope, it has commanding views around to neighbouring islands and across the sea. But perhaps there's something more to this location than just its position in the landscape. And the project has uncovered some interesting insights into the alignment of the tomb itself. Just like at Mace Howe, with the alignment on the midwinter solstice sunset, it seems at Tavsotuic, the tomb, the lower tomb entrance passage, was aligned on the midwinter solstice sunrise. Because on the morning, if the sun and the clouds are right, the light shines up and bounces across the sea and shines up the entrance passage and illuminates the chamber inside. And it's been really interesting to just rediscover this phenomenon, which was noticed in the 1980s. And we've been able to highlight this amazing phenomena at the Tavsotuic tomb. So I hope you've enjoyed this whistle-stop tour of the tombs of the North Isles of Orkney in preparation for other more detailed talks on the selected topics. Where can you find out more information? Well, of course, there's the web resource that we've created as part of this project, where each island has a list of tombs, and you can click in and explore the information, drawings, and there are links to the 3D models that we've created and others that exist as well. There is, of course, Canmore, the Pass Map, which contains the National Monument Record, where you can explore the sites and monuments from all periods across Orkney. There's a great resource on the Orkney Stone Tools website, where there's lots of detailed records for the different Neolithic sites, Neolithic settlement sites, Neolithic tombs, the objects, with lots of 3D models and biographies of the people that excavated them. There's lots of information on the Nessa Brodka website. Tresness Tomb has its own website that you can explore. And there's lots of articles that you could download for free off the Proceedings of Antiquaries of Scotland journal website. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoy this talk series from the Tombs of the Isles project. The next talk is by Professor Colin Richards about death and burial in Neolithic Orkney. Goodbye.